So in this part of the video, I'd like to discuss some of the mini projects in our lecture notes. Let's start with a mini project in VBA Part I. Here I have my solution to VBA Part I. So to run this, let me start a new workbook. I'm going to store all my VBA mini projects in this workbook. So I'll insert a module into this workbook. So that's my workbook 3. By the way, there's nothing special about book 3. You can use whatever you can store the code in any workbook you like. Okay, just right. So sometimes people ask me where should they insert their VBA code, right? Exactly in which workbook should they insert their VBA code? Most part, it doesn't really matter that much, right? So in a minute, you will see that in this exercise, I'm going to try to change the content in book 2 and also the content in VBA Part 1, right? So I'm actually going to manipulate VBA Part 1 and book 2. So in this case, I normally prefer that I don't insert my VBA code in these workbooks because I'm going to change them and later I might close them or open them. So I would like to insert my code in a separate workbook. I would think of this workbook as sort of a master workbook where it contains my VBA code, and I will use the code stored here to manipulate these other books, right? And because in VBA, by inserting a code into a workbook, you can actually use that code to manipulate any other workbooks. So where you insert the code is not that important. Just later on, just make sure that when you save this book 3 or whatever workbook you insert into as a macro-enabled workbook, that's the important thing. Okay, save that as a macro-enabled workbook later. So remember, when you insert a module, right-click on this project and go to Insert, and then go to Module. Okay, so after you insert this, you should see this module folder. Right? You can either close it or open it, and you should have your module in there. If you want to insert another module, there should be a module 2 or module 3. Right? So sometimes people make mistake by trying to insert modules by clicking on, for example, here this workbook. You can insert a module here too, or by even clicking on this worksheet, you can insert a module too. Right? So those might be useful for some situations, but in general, what we would like to requires us to insert a module directly at the workbook. Okay, if you insert a module in the wrong places, then you will get trouble when you run the code. So after I insert my module, let me go to my VBA project and copy the solution to my first mini project into the module. So by reading the code, you can probably guess here what I would like to do is to change the content or the value of cell A1 in sheet 1 in workbook VBA Part 1 to OU, and then I'm also going to change the background color of that cell and also the font color of that cell. And finally, I'm going to change the name of sheet 1 in VBA Part 1 to school. Right. So let's run this quickly and see what happens. So this VBA Part 1, this is the workbook that I would like to change. So if I press F8, so here I intentionally selected the sheet 2 of this workbook. You can also see that right now sheet 1 is also empty, right? Both sheets are empty. So I intentionally selected sheet 2 and let's see what happens. Right. First, I have run the first 3 lines, right? So you can see, even though I didn't select sheet 1 here, I'm trying to change the values in sheet 1. Even though I didn't select sheet 1, if I go back to sheet 1, the values there have already changed. Right? So here, because I'm using this full reference in the sense that I start with workbook and then worksheet and then the range or cell. So it doesn't matter which sheet or which book is currently active. When I run my code here, it will always go change the value of the intended location or the intended cell. Right? So that's the benefit of using full reference. So you can avoid unexpected results. Right? Finally, I want to change the name of sheet 1 in this workbook to school. So right now it's still sheet 1. So if I press F8 and run that, the name has changed to school. So now I have done all the tasks in the subroutine. Right? So let me try to make this make the letters here a little bigger so it's easier for you to see. Okay, now it's probably easier for you to see this. Alright, so that's how we change the value of a range or the name of a worksheet. So I would like to explore some different approaches. So here I'm using a full reference. Let's think about what's going to happen. Let me call this subroutine 1B just to differentiate these two. So what if instead of using the full reference, I omit these upper level objects? Okay. For the last one, I cannot omit the worksheet because otherwise the code would complain about an error. So this is the shortest code I can do. Right? But for the first three, I can omit both the workbook name and the sheet name. So now the reference starts with the range name or cell name. So I directly say change the value of A1 to OU. Okay. Let's see what's going to happen if I run a code like this. So to see the results, let me go back and restore the values here. I'm going to delete this. So we have an empty. Okay, now we still have an empty cell and empty sheet, and the names are all restored. So here you can see I have two workbooks open, right? One is my VBA Part I, the other is another empty workbook called Book 2, right? So let's see what happens if before I run my code, I click on Workbook 2 and I select Sheet 2. So before I run my code, I click on Workbook 2 and select Sheet 2. Now if I run my code, so I'm going to use F8. Okay, so let me put this somewhere so you can see both. There's nothing in my VBA Part 1, Sheet 1. And also, the name of sheet 1 is not changed. Instead, I put all this content in book 2, sheet 2, A1. And also, the name of sheet 1 in book 2 has been changed to school. Okay. So, this example illustrates that if you do not specify the higher level objects in your reference, you directly start from the lower level objects, then Excel will basically assume that you mean the currently active worksheet and the currently active workbook. And because before I run my code, I clicked on book 2 and sheet 2. So when I run the code, the active book is book 2. The active sheet is the sheet 2 in this book. Therefore, the content change is always in this book and this sheet. Okay. But what if before I run my code again, I click on book 2 and select sheet 2. I do the same thing, but instead of running the second code, the second subroutine, I go back to run the first subroutine. Let's see what happens in this case. So watch here, and also watch here. Okay. In the first subroutine, because I used a full reference, so even though when I run my code, the active workbook was book 2, but nevertheless, because I told the VBA to change the values in book VBA Part 1 and sheet 1, so it's actually going there. So when you use a full reference, you do not have to make assumption about which book is currently active. So clearly, this is a lot safer approach, especially when you're working on multiple workbooks. So let's say I do want to use a shorter reference here. Is there any way to make sure that I'm actually working on VBA Part 1 and Worksheet 1 in there? And the answer is yes. So to make this safer, or to make sure that we're actually working on this workbook, what you can do is before you run that code, you can say workbooks VBA Part 1 dot activate. Okay. So in this case, suppose when you run the code, VBA Part 1 is not the currently active book. After you run this line, it will become the active book. Okay. And also, because you want to operate on sheet 1 in VBA Part 1, so you also need to activate worksheet sheet 1. Okay. So you must do this in this order. So activate the book first, and then activate the sheet you want in that workbook. So let's see what happens if I run this code. Again, I'm going to restore the empty workbook and also restore the sheet name, so you can see the results. Okay, so here we have two workbooks restored to their original condition. So empty workbooks sheet 1, sheet 2, and empty workbooks sheet 1, sheet 2. Right. So for the purpose of illustration, I'm going to, before I run my code, I'm going to go to VBA Part 1, and in this workbook, I'm going to select sheet 2. And then I'm going to select, before I run my code, I'm going to select book 2. And I'm also going to select sheet 2. Right? So you know that before I run my code, the currently active book is book 2. Okay, now I go to my code. Let's see what happens if I run this revised code. I'm going to use F8. Okay, first of all, VBA Part 1 is activated, and now I want to activate sheet 1. So right now you can see the selected tab in VBA Part 1 is sheet 2. But after I run this line, now the selected tab is sheet 1. So that means sheet 1 is activated. So now if I run my code, then you can see, even though here I only have the cell location, which is A1, but actually because I activated this workbook and this sheet, so it's actually changing the A1 in the intended location. Okay. Also, I want to change, again here I didn't say which workbook, I just say I want to change the name of sheet 1 to school. But because I activated VBA Part 1, now it's changing this name to school, okay, instead of the name in book 2. Okay, just to summarize, when you try to refer to a cell or a range in a worksheet, to be sure that you're getting to the location that you really want to get to, one way is to use this full reference, right? You start from the top level, which is workbook, and then go down to worksheet, and then go down to the range or cell. So in this way, there's no ambiguity, right? So if you want to use a shorter reference by omitting these higher level objects, then if you do not use anything, put anything before this, then basically VBA will assume that you mean the currently active workbook and currently active sheet. That's kind of a risky thing to do, because you don't know which one is active when you run the code. To be sure that this is active and this is active, you want to add these two lines to explicitly activate these objects before you refer to the levels contained in them. Okay, now I'm done with this mini project. So like I said earlier, I would like to save this book 3 that contains my code as a macro enabled workbook. So to do that, I'm going to say save book 3, and I'm going to call that mini projects. So basically I'll put most of my mini projects in this particular workbook. So I'm going to choose the type of the file should be Excel macro enabled workbook. Make sure you choose this, right? Otherwise, if you save this as a regular workbook, then you would lose all the code you have entered, right? If you want to save the code, then you need to save this as a macro enabled file. Okay. All right, that's it for this project.